white gods of the Native Americans were Greeks, according to researchers' claims. In an ancient area, in an era, it seems that the American continent was colonized by groups of Tartar and Mongolian hunters from Siberia. Logic says that these groups that invaded the American continent passed through the straits of the Kamchatka Peninsula, which at that time was a continuation of the land connecting Alaska with the farthest northern point of Asia. They are the ones who then made the Mongolian type of the Native American Indians. They are the ones that the Greeks found when they reached the hitherto unexplored continent of the western hemisphere of the planet. They are the ones who saw the pure white flesh, the whitewashed cloaks of the Greeks that were their high presentation, their ultra-modern boats that looked strange in front of their crude dugouts, and of course they saw them as gods. The ancient Native American Indian text writes about the strange visitors who came to their country and brought them culture. The god Helataki was priest and god, the king of the white settlers. Those white people were wise, peaceful, and tall. They had white skin and long beards, the native legends claims. It's logical that the inhabitants of America at that time, who were ignorant of what the earth was like, what area it occupied, and if there were other people somewhere else, that those visitors seemed strange to them, even considered them because of the great morphological differences, but mainly of the knowledge that they possessed, something of a kind of gods. So they created the gods in their imagination on those standards, the standards of the ancient Greeks who arrived there in the distant land of Hesperia with their ships and with a culture with them which they left behind in the world that was still in a primitive state but not wild. Proof of the assimilation not only of the material part of the culture, but also of the spiritual part, which mainly has to do with language and speech. And that's why the similarities of many words of the ancient peoples of America with the Greek language are a point of reference for many scientists, locals, and foreigners. When after several centuries, the new visitors led by Christopher Columbus appeared on the shores of the American coast, the natives welcomed them like gods. The great explorer himself narrates in his memoirs, "The only feeling the Indians felt for us was worship and admiration." And then he adds, "As soon as the Indians saw us on their shores, they fell to the ground in a rage, raised their hands in the sky full of joy, and they were calling us to go ashore as soon as possible." Their tradition said that those one who once came and brought them the light of civilization would return, who gave them the order and the way of how they would live better through a correct cultural development. They gave them civilization, and that said a lot to those who lived until then in a state that suited animals and not humans. How can they not be grateful to them? How can they not consider them gods? So the reaction described by Christopher Columbus on behalf of the Native Americans is very reasonable, but it seems more logical when one encounters in the tradition or in their old ancient texts the nostalgia of a return of these ancients. In their religious ceremonies, the Native Americans wear white masks or paint their faces white in memory of those white gods who civilized them. Their priests also wear helmets decorated with bull horns. These helmets were worn by the soldiers of Kronos Vilos, but it's also the symbol of the Cretan culture, the times of the Minoan culture, the Heterocretans, the great and strongest seafarers of all time. The tall visitors to America, white-clad and bearded in the ancient Indian texts say, are Greek gods, or the era of the god kings of Uranus, Saturn, Atlas, Poseidon, and Dionysus. Many ancient texts of our present time present them as giants, genus of crater giants, or you praise within Olympus, you are Olympians, writes Hesiod, giving the mark on those who these tall, white giants and bearded creatures were. Anax, childbearing, blood of giants, Nonnos Dionysiacs, Volume 2, Book 40th, page 313, verse 315. And Apollodorus says, a giant is born from the sky, but it happens in Pallene. Now, Plato writes, while this island of Atlantis, a great and admirable power of kings, held the island of many other islands and parts of the continent, many but rulers many others across the sea, islands and parts of the continent. Poseidon swept Atlantis, his offspring inhabited. Plato writes about Atlantis, showing us that it was inhabited by the Greek races, the placement of Atlantis in the Western Hemisphere, where, as Plato says, there were other islands and a continent. In the sea of islands and parts of the continent reveals the knowledge of the existence of the American continent in Plato's time. Since Plato knows of its existence, it's natural to accept that his accounts of Atlantis and America must be true, and why should we question them when everything is obvious that they talk about the Greeks, the white gods of America, in the remotest years of prehistory? In order to prove the antiquity of the city of Argos, its founder Inachus claims his origin from Oceanus, who was a child of Uranus and Gaia. So Inachus founds the city of Argos and reigned for 60 years with Milea, daughter of Oceanus, and she consequently his sister. Here we must clarify that very often in prehistory we see similar marriages occurring, which of course is symbolic and proves thus the purity of the race, gave birth to Phoroneus, Egalia, and Io, and let us note here that it is not Io from whose generation Danaos will later be born, who will take the kingdom of Argos, specifically from Galanoris, the son of Sthenelus, and will put an end to the Eneikids by creating the dynasty of the Nadians and naming the inhabitants of the kingdom of Argos Danaos, the Danites, but her ancestor. The Phoronean son of Inachus is said to have gathered the people in the city and built a temple in honor of Hera. He also gave laws to the human community, and that is why the city was called Argos Phoronikos. It was then that the fight between Hera and Poseidon took place for the protection of the city, and because the Argives judged Hera, Poseidon, enraged, throws a water shortage in the area, hence the thirsty Argos. From Kedro, Phoroneus gave birth to Api, who was a cruel king, but had managed to extend the borders of his kingdom to almost the entire Peloponnese, which took the name Appia from him. His oppression and cruelty are causes which brought about the displeasure of the world and compelled him to exile himself in Egypt. So we see again the reference to Egypt as in the continuation with Danaos, the Danites. But this is something that we will meet in other cases in prehistory. And I would venture to say that this frequency proves only one thing: Egypt belonged to the Greeks. It may sound strange, but it is true. When the priest of Sadais tells Solon that the Greeks were older than the Egyptians and that the city of Athens existed thousands of years earlier than Egypt, it's not at all improbable to assume that the Greeks laid the foundations of civilization in Egypt as well. After all, even after the victory of the Greeks over the Ixus, the Egyptians gave the kingdom to Kronos with Hermes Trismegistus, Thoth as we know him, as his secretary, whom the Egyptians worshipped as a god and called him Thoth. So also Apis, as we know, was the deity of the Egyptians. According to others, Phoroneus gives birth to 3 sons, Pelasgus, Iasos, and Agenorus, as we read in the Orgygia of Stagiritis. These 3 shared the kingdom, and Pelasgus received that part around Erasenos River, where he also built Larissa of Argos, a name he gave in honor of his daughter Larissa. Iasos received a place that was located towards the area of Elidus, and finally Agenor, who took the paternal horses because he fed many, as we are informed by Stagiritis. And this is from the ancient Greek spirit. I've translated from a Greek article for you. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Finally, support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.